Thank you, sir. I thank the Premier, the Opposition Leader and the Leader of the House for the comments that they have made. This House will support this resolution in a bipartisan fashion, and we will do so because this Parliament sees the importance of recognising that this act of grotesque terror that has been inflicted by Hamas on Israel and the people of Israel cannot go uncommented and uncondemned. We also have to recognise that these are challenging and difficult times. Not only, of course, they are the most challenging and difficult times for families living in Israel and in Gaza as well. But for our community here in South Australia, the community around the world, anyone observing these atrocities cannot help but feel a connection if they find in their humanity, they will feel a connection to the experience of those families who experienced this terror. But we also have other connections as well. We have Australians who have family in Israel and in Gaza who are directly feeling that challenge. There is distress felt by people in Australia who have not just personal connections but also spiritual connections with Israel and Palestine who will feel particularly affected. And I think sometimes people ask why this House would talk about issues relating to international affairs when that is not the mandate of the State Parliament. Unfortunately, the experience of people, and I think particularly in the Jewish community, for reasons I'll get to in a moment, of people living in South Australia, the experience of antisemitism is still unfortunately present. And we must consider that. That is a clear and immediate issue with which the State Parliament's responsibilities are squarely brought into play. Something that the government does give consideration to, and I appreciate that. In the last year alone, issues raised at Adelaide University were raised by the Leader of the Opposition and responded to by the Premier in a very firm way. I think that was important for our South Australian Jewish community to understand. I'm going to touch briefly on all three of these matters. The first is in relation to the grotesque inhumanity experienced a little over a week ago when a dance party was turned into a place of slaughter and terror, when we saw, and it's dreadfully unfortunate that the experience of social media in the world made it necessary for there to be pictorial evidence shown, but we saw children slaughtered and brutalised, burnt. The experience of families whose homes were invaded by terrorists who were not acting in inconsequential ways. They were acting in intentional ways to terrorise a community by seeking out innocence, by committing atrocities intentionally. That was the end, not an unintended circumstance. That was the goal. And Hamas, it must be said, and it is so important to say, Hamas does not equate with Palestine or with Islam. Hamas does not speak for our Palestinian community or our Islamic community in any way. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. And indeed, the atrocities that Hamas has committed upon Palestinian people and Islamic people and has sought through their actions has seen happen to Palestine, seen happen to Islamic people, I think has Hamas squarely as an enemy of all peoples. So the inhumanity must be understood. It must be understood that a Palestinian community and Islamic community in South Australia, there is no reflection on them when we identify the grotesque inhumanity and atrocity committed by Hamas, the terrorist organisation that it is. It is important in a local context to identify the difference between expressing sympathy and solidarity with innocent victims of a conflict and indeed those who are celebrating the brutal behaviour of Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organisation, and those who and haven't seen anything like what we saw in Sydney here in South Australia in recent times, and that's to be acknowledged, but those who would seek to celebrate such behaviours are celebrating terrorism, and there are actual hate speech crimes that are on the statutes that should be enforced. It's also important at a time of reflecting on an atrocity that our Parliament stands united in desiring a peaceful future for the whole world, obviously, for people who have family in Israel, in Gaza. We want them to experience peace in their lives. And our desire to see that in the years ahead is worth stating on the record as the Premier, the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the House, and now I do. I come to the relevance for South Australia. We're joined in the gallery not only by Norm Schuler, as others have recognised, but also by Kathy Bakich and members of the board of the Adelaide Holocaust Museum, Stoner Education Centre. And the Leader of the Opposition reflected on the last 100 years, the, again, grotesque industrial genocide committed upon the Jewish people by the Nazi regime in the Shoah, the Holocaust, is actually an important matter for all South Australians, all of our children to understand and learn about at all times. And I think that the behaviours of some people in the community, in fact the behaviours of people with no personal, religious or ethnic connection to Israel or Palestine in Australia is worth highlighting the importance of Holocaust education. I'm going to go back a step further than that and then come back to the work of the Holocaust Museum, thanking them for their work. The resilience of the Jewish people in the face of repeated upon repeated generations and millennia of repression and persecution is something to base our hopes for a peaceful future on. Just in the last week and a half, the Israeli flag was put on display on the Arch of Titus in Rome. Titus was a Roman general, son of the Emperor Vespasian, who would later become Emperor of Rome. Titus was leading the siege of Jerusalem in the decades following the birth of Jesus. And indeed, in that siege, atrocities were committed on the Jewish people. And there was years and years where the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem prior to eventually the taking of the city. The city was sacked and looted, and the Arch of Titus is in many ways, it's seen now as a tourist attraction outside the Colosseum that Vespasian and Titus built. It is seen as a beautiful symbol we think of as ancient history, but for the Jewish people, it is so much more than that. And in the times, as I understand it, in recent decades, it's become a symbol of that Jewish resilience, that the Jewish population in Rome has continued to be an important part of the Roman community for a very long time, especially in the period since the Second World War. And the Arch of Titus, with the Israeli flag on it, as I understand it, has become also a symbol of that Jewish resilience. But the Jewish people have been persecuted singularly and in unique ways over the millennia since as well. Well, the Magna Carta we think of as a foundational document in our history, in our heritage of the Westminster tradition, the freedoms of our people to be free from persecution from kings and oligarchs, autocrats. Yet, as we have one displayed in our own parliamentary library, as I think we should, it's an important and useful historical document. It's more than something to just look at behind a glass because we got this copy from Westminster. It bears actually reading in translation at some point. And for our Jewish community, reading that document highlights again the persecution that they suffered. It was not by no means the worst persecution the Jewish people suffered in the last millennium, but Jewish people are singled out in that document for different treatment to Christian people. Jewish people in England under the time of the Magna Carta were singled out for different treatment. Jewish people were expelled from entire countries throughout Europe over the last 1,000 years. I reflect on my own faith, which is, I'm a baptised Lutheran, as many people would know, and the history surrounding the Reformation. It is a challenging moment when we're thinking of the resilience shown by the Jewish people over millennia, it's challenging to look through the works of the interpreter of theology that was at the basis of the Lutheran Church. Martin Luther was a persuasive and important figure in world history, and he wrote at one point a treatise called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. He was working very hard to bring Jewish people into the Lutheran Church at that time. And some years later, when not many Jewish people had joined the Lutheran Church, perhaps unsurprisingly, Martin Luther wrote a piece called On the Jews on Their Lies, which was several hundred years later, 400 years later, used and published, republished, circulated by Adolf Hitler, and again propagating the hate that backed up his regime of horror and terror. Antisemitism is not the only example of racist hatred that the world has experienced and become familiar with. Many minorities, religious and ethnic, have experienced persecution and hatred and had to deal with that. But I think that in the 20th century, following the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were murdered on an industrial, intentional, and genocidal scale, the fact that 70 years later, so many young Australians have not got that understanding of something like the Holocaust that influences their behaviour today is most unfortunate, and I think it has consequences for our community. I mentioned before the Holocaust Museum. We had a body of work undertaken in 2020 and 2021 in the Education Department when I was the Minister for Education that was focused on Holocaust education. It was much broader than that. It was a body of work that was writing curriculum units for use in public education and non-government schools that would want them across all levels of the Australian curriculum. And the Holocaust Museum, which is recently established, was very important in ensuring that the material presented in units that dealt with the Holocaust in the history curriculum were accurate, because there's a lot of material out there, some of which was at one point potentially going to be used in the curriculum, which is actually counterproductive and unhelpful. It was very great assistance to the Education Department, and I hope that the relationship continues as materials are updated. The Holocaust Museum was able to identify materials that trivialise the Holocaust in any way and make sure that they weren't part of the curriculum that we're offering. And it's important that our young people have access to this information. It's important that schools teach about the Holocaust, because it is, firstly, in the lifetimes of many people in our community. We have Holocaust survivors in our community, people like Andrew Steiner, who teach young people about the Holocaust, but they won't be with us forever. So the museum and the curriculum become tremendously even more important. Holocaust is a tangible experience for so many people in our community that have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who had some experience of it. It's something that can be taught in schools to give us an understanding not just of anti-Semitism and the profound and negative and disastrous role that it has played in our heritage and history, but also all hate, all racism. The Holocaust Museum, if people have not had the chance to attend, the Holocaust Museum is on Wakefield Street. It's on the corner of Gawler Place. It's easy to get to. School groups are there almost every day that it is open, but get in touch with them, please. I encourage you to go and have a look, because what it is not just this historical perspective on the Holocaust itself, but it is an appeal against racism. It is an appeal for humanity. It is relevant to our Aboriginal South Australians as well, Aboriginal Australians. It tells the story of the embassy taken by Aboriginal leaders in the 1930s, I think, to the German embassy in an appeal on behalf of the Jewish community, on behalf of German Jews, taken by Aboriginal Australians. That broad story needs to be told and understood more. I think that there's more that we can do in our schools, and the rollout of those resources is tremendously important. So, in supporting this motion, and I trust it will be supported unanimously by the House. We acknowledge the reprehensible and grotesque nature of the acts that were committed and perpetrated by Hamas. We recognise that Hamas is responsible for what has happened since as well. I just want to finish with a couple of reflections from where the world is looking at this. I note that the President Macron of France, Chancellor Scholz of Germany, Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, Prime Minister Sunak of the United Kingdom and President Biden of the United States took the extraordinary step of putting out a joint statement last week. Part of that statement said all of us recognise the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people and support equal measures of justice and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. But make no mistake, Hamas does not represent those aspirations, and it offers nothing for the Palestinian people other than more terror and bloodshed. And from our party's point of view, in Australia, in the Federal Parliament, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs Simon Birmingham said Hamas has brought Israel's response upon itself, and in doing so it has tragically exposed to danger the very people they falsely claim to stand for. Hamas are responsible for the current loss of Israeli, Palestinian and other innocent lives. And on to say nobody wants to see innocent lives lost, least of all those of other children. They deserve our care and support too, and that is why the Coalition supports properly targeted humanitarian assistance. However, let us not be led into false equivalences. In attack, Hamas acts with surprise and with intent to brutally kill women and children. In defence, Hamas acts with cowardice by using women and children as shields. Israel, in contrast, provides public warnings to minimise civilian losses, acting in defence to target the weapons capabilities and perpetrators of terrorist acts. Mr. Speaker, here in this House we pray for peace. We pray for the peace and well-being of people in Israel and in Gaza and in Palestine and in the world, and for South Australians of Israeli and Jewish, Palestinian or Islamic heritage and faith. We pray for peace as well.